This is the sixth video in a series on how to do a cybersecurity risk assessment. It forms part of the first stage of the GRC lifecycle, assess risk. In the previous video, we requested and received extra information from our client because we realized we did not have the complete picture. We were missing some information from them. I wanted to add on that in real life, you would ideally collect together all the information you think you're missing that you want to request, any questions that you have, and you give this to the client all at once so that you're sending them one list of things that you need instead of pestering them frequently with little things here and there. It's best to just get it all together and give it to them in one lot that they can then take care of. Now, in this video, we will build out the remaining details for each risk in the risk table of our cybersecurity risk assessment document. If we look at what we need to do to complete each risk we came up with based on our client scenario, we know that threats are problems we encounter that can cause risks to occur. These can also be called threat sources. Risk factors are circumstances. Generally, they're going to be vulnerabilities or weaknesses that contribute towards the rating of a risk by either making the risk more likely to occur or having a more severe impact if the risk does occur. When we have risk consequences, the bad things that happen when a risk occurs. We take this scenario from an earlier video where we have somebody walking along at night, holding their phone. They're about to walk right past a banana peel, and that's right next to a cactus. And then we have someone in a wheelchair. Try pausing the video and identifying any threat sources, risk factors, or consequences in what you can see. Maybe you came up with something like this. The banana peel is the threat source because that's where the whole situation begins, with the person stepping on the banana peel and slipping. The fact that it's nighttime is a risk factor because this makes it harder for the person to see. So it's more likely that they will not see the banana peel and step on it. The phone is a risk factor because it's distracting the person. So it's making them less likely to be aware of their surroundings and therefore more likely to step on the banana peel. The cactus is a risk factor because if the person slips over, they may normally just fall onto the ground and could hurt themselves that way. But because the cactus is there, they could fall onto the cactus first, get stabbed by all the prickles, then they hit the ground. So the fact that the cactus is right next to the banana peel means the severity or the impact of the risk is higher. And then the person in the wheelchair is the risk consequence. This represents the person being hurt after this risk eventuates. We can then take these principles and apply them to our existing scenario risks. In this case, we have our first risk for cargo trail logistics, the risk of unauthorized access to cargo trail logistics files and systems. When we look at the risk description and statement, the first sentence is just a single sentence describing the risk in more detail than the title alone. In the second sentence, we are talking about the impact from a CIA point of view, confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So when we think about this risk, because we're talking about unauthorized access, that will generally mean there is some element of confidentiality. So we've already talked about information disclosure, but you may also want to protect information, not only because you don't want people to see what's in it because it's something confidential, but it may simply be something important. You don't want to have the company payroll information, for example, where you not only don't want people to see what other people get paid, but you don't want people with the ability to change this information to increase their own salary, for example. You don't want people to be able to delete this information either. So this is why we consider not only confidentiality in the form of disclosure, but integrity as well, because if you are protecting against unauthorized access, then people who get unauthorized access can attack the integrity. But we can also have availability. And this is because if we think, as we covered in a previous video, that when you're talking about deleting information, that's actually integrity. When we're talking about availability, we are talking about systems. And if you have unauthorized access to things that you should not be able to access, you would have the ability to, say, affect the ability of people who have access to a system. Their username is included in the list of authorized users. If someone was to play around with that, you can cause other people to not have access to a system because you've altered what they can access. This is an example of where someone has access to something they shouldn't be able to. They can then affect the availability for other people to access something. We then consider the threat sources for this risk, where the risk can originate from. One example of this is accidental sharing, where someone might have some information and they either send it to someone outside of a company, for example, or they might send it to someone within a company. But in either case, the recipient is not supposed to have access to that information. And it can be something as simple as that. Someone simply has access and they don't realize, maybe, or they're not thinking, or they're not informed. They give access, they send the information to someone else who should not have access to that thing. This can be an origin point for unauthorized access when you accidentally share it with somebody else. We could also have a curious employee where maybe there were not sufficient access controls in place and someone who worked in the sales department and should not have access to, say, HR information. They might go looking for something, maybe some kind of policy that they're supposed to review and sign off on, and they're in the HR files and folders, and they find out that they can actually access payroll information and other HR information, people's contracts, and they shouldn't be able to do that. And they've stumbled across this accidentally. They are a legitimate employee at the company. They have access to some things, but they shouldn't have access to this particular information because no one ever put proper access controls in place. And then we can have a malicious actor where somebody uses a phishing email, for example, to trick someone at a company to giving access to that person. They might take over their account. They might trick an IT support person into thinking they're a legitimate employee, that they're posing as somebody else. And then they trick that IT person to give them access, to send them a password reset email or something like that, because they lock themselves out. So it all originates with the malicious actor. So these are examples of threats that could apply to other risks as well, but it was just a good way to start out with this first risk that you will find in a lot of companies, a lot of situations, the risk of unauthorized access. If we then look at risk factors, we're looking at problems that may be there. Maybe we are aware of these, maybe we know they're there, or potential ones that could be there that are potentially making this risk worse. Since we're talking about unauthorized access, an easy one is access controls may simply not be there. If you have a small company, a small business, a startup, they may not have the IT expertise or the time and resources to go and properly think about who should access what and configure access. So this may be missing completely in some cases. There may be some access controls, but they may just be wrong. They may have accidentally given someone, a new person they hired to be a salesperson, they may have not given them the right set of access. There is something there, but it's just not good enough. Another quite common one is when people are offboarded from a company, like if someone gets fired or they resign, something like this, when they leave a company, you should disable someone's account immediately when they cease employment. But it can often be the case that this doesn't happen. It may not happen in a timely manner. It may take days. It may take a week. It may not happen at all. This is a very common issue as well. And so because we don't shut down this person's access, once they've left the company, if they can still use their account to access what they did before, this is an example of unauthorized access. We may also have this issue of access reviews where you don't just have a new person start at a company or something and you give them access to various things and then you never have to touch it again. In some cases, people will change roles. They may have expanded responsibilities. They may have to cover for somebody else. And so you may have to give them additional access on top of what they normally have. And it's not uncommon for there to not be proper access reviews where you consider, okay, we have this HR information. Someone used to help out generally with administration and operations, and they helped out a bit with HR as well. Now they're no longer doing that. If we don't have access reviews where we go through who has access to different things and think about whether they still need to have access, we're not necessarily going to go and disable access to the HR information, even though this person doesn't need it anymore. They shouldn't have it. It's similar in some ways to offboarding. When someone leaves a company altogether, in this case, you haven't left the company, but you've just got different responsibilities. So this is also quite a common issue that companies do not necessarily have regular access reviews. Another factor here is the fact that the digital logistics platform and other cargo trail logistics systems do store sensitive information. So this does heighten the impact if we were to have unauthorized access. If you had unauthorized access to something that wasn't that big of a deal, then that's different to having highly sensitive information. And then because we're talking about availability, if we were to have some kind of issue with service provided by the DLP, the fact that it's critical to cargo trail logistics operations means that we also have an increased level of severity if something was to happen. For the risk consequences, up the top, we list out which of these three, confidentiality, integrity, and availability, which of them are applicable to this risk. So in the template I've got, it's set up with all of them there and it says delete as required. In this particular case, we're going to keep all of them because we've already identified up here that we could have an impact on all three of the CIA principles. Otherwise, with risk consequences, we need to think from, say, a business point of view, an operational point of view, from a legal point of view, financial point of view, what are the different types of consequences that we could have? One thing you can do to make this a bit easier is if you think about the different types of impacts on confidentiality, if something confidential at the target organization was disclosed, what are the potential consequences for any kind of confidential information being disclosed? If any kind of information had its integrity compromised, if it was modified or deleted, what would the consequences be? If any kind of system had availability problems, what would the consequences be? And you can then get a big list. Then when you go through each risk, you can just look at that big list. And instead of having to come up with things from scratch every single time, you can pull from your existing list this pool of confidentiality, integrity, and availability consequences. It can make this process a bit easier. So when I was creating my full risk assessment I'm using to fill in this template, I wasn't just making these up as I got to each risk. I had already thought through what are all the potential CIA consequences, made a big list, and it definitely sped up this process. So if we look at these consequences specifically, we are potentially talking about personal information like HR information, salary information. So therefore, we do have personal. We also have commercial information because, of course, this is a company that we're talking about. And they are dealing with suppliers, they're dealing with customers. And then you have the names of people like the truck drivers who are doing the logistics deliveries. So we have a mix of personal and commercial information that we need to protect. So therefore, if we had a compromise of confidentiality, that's the sort of information that could be disclosed. Regulatory compliance breach is also a major consequence because this could lead to huge fines. People don't really talk or think enough about privacy. Privacy is a huge issue. And if you are found to be collecting information about your employees, or in this case, your suppliers or truck drivers, you will have their personal information. It's not so much the case for a business to business setup like Cargo Trail Logistics has, but if you had a company that's more business to consumer, then you'll be collecting the personal information of your customers all the time. And this is definitely a serious thing that needs to be protected. And if it's not protected properly, you can have pretty big consequences in terms of fines. So this is quite a serious consequence that has very real implications, but is not talked about enough or considered enough, in my opinion. We then have financial loss because if you had this links to the one at the bottom, reputation damage, as well as a compliance breach. If you did have disclosure of this information, you could lose business. You could have both business customers who get you to ship things for them, then also logistics suppliers like truck drivers who do the work for you, who make your operations possible, they may not want to work with you anymore. You may just have simple fines from compliance breaches. So this can definitely lead to financial loss as a consequence. If we think about the fact that it's specifically a logistics company, it's all about taking the right shipment and delivering it to the right location within a decent time frame. And if we have information that's wrong, if we have modification of information, this can lead to shipments being sent to the wrong location or recipient. We could also have shipments that are unable to be delivered, where we may have just some confusion. If in our system, we, for example, had the information pertaining to a shipment deleted completely, we don't know who the shipment was even from and where it's supposed to go or even what it is. Because we're dealing with international logistics and domestic, we have things like customs clearance to consider. And if we have our information around a shipment modified or it's deleted, we can then have a delay of custom clearance, or maybe it can't proceed at all. If our system is not available, then we cannot have customers placing orders through the digital logistics platform. And then as a follow on from that, we may have issues with invoicing and payment reconciliation because a lot of these things are done through the DLP. If the DLP was not working, we would have employees who are not able to work properly because the platform is central to the business operations and function of this company. So if we had availability problems, then people just can't do their job. This also ties back into financial loss because then you're paying people to sit around and do nothing, and you're not able to earn the revenue as you normally would. Because we use the digital logistics platform as a way to do many different functions, we track shipments through it, we communicate with customers through it, we have some of our financial processes, such as customer invoicing and payment reconciliation through the system. If we're putting all our eggs in one basket, if this system has an availability problem, then that would really knock out a lot of different functions and operations that we would normally do. We also have the fact that if you do have some kind of problem, some kind of breach or incident, we'd have to, at the very least, have some people investigate what was going on. You potentially have the cost of bringing in outside investigators, if not just the disruption of your own teams not being able to do what they normally do because they've got to figure out what went wrong. Because if something did happen, you can't just ignore it. It may happen again. Well, probably will happen again. And so there's just the general cost and disruption from any kind of incident occurring, and the cleanup cost essentially. And then you want to find out what went wrong so you can prevent it from happening in the future, or at least reduce the chance of it recurring in the future. And then we've got reputational damage, where, of course, no company or organization wants to have a hack or a breach or an incident, something like this, but it does happen. And if it's not handled in the right way, if there is a lack of transparency or insufficient transparency, then this can definitely potentially lead to reputational damage, where both customers and or suppliers will not trust the organization as much, and they simply don't want to do business with you in the future. So we've now filled in the remaining risk details as much as we're going to do for now. We're going to do the controls in a later video because this needs a more dedicated explanation in its own video. And we will also look at the risk ratings in another video as well. So for now, our first risk now has a title. We now describe it in a sentence. We specifically call out the consequences as it relates to the CIA. We've then got a few threat sources. I wouldn't worry about having too many here. If you just aim to think of maybe 2 as a target number for each of your risks. We then have our risk factors, which are our weaknesses or vulnerabilities contributing to the risk. From my experience, some clients want you to already know what the risk factors are. They have to be real. In this case, I have provided a mix of some that we're aware about and some that are theoretical, because we don't know if access controls are missing or if they're misconfigured. We don't know if they do offboarding properly or not. We don't know if they do access reviews at all, let alone frequently enough or not. But we do know that there's sensitive information in the system. We do know that the DLP is critical to CTL business operations. So when you're doing this for real, you will have to consider what your client wants you to do, which approach they want you to do. But in this case, there's nothing wrong with trying to come up with some ideas for what might be wrong instead of just relying purely on what we know to be wrong. And especially because we're dealing with a fictional scenario, we do have to be a bit more creative. And this will then help you in real life try to figure out some of these things earlier on when you're doing the business context. You might be asking some questions at that point early in the process. When you're doing the information gathering phase, you might be already asking these sort of questions. How do you manage access? And the response to that can then give you some ideas of what may or may not be in place. And then we've got a big list of risk consequences. As I said, it may help to just list out everything you can think of as it relates to the client company in terms of what sort of confidential information do they have, and what would be the consequences if that was disclosed. If any of the information was damaged or deleted, so an attack on integrity, what would potentially happen? And then if any of their systems had an availability problem, what would be the real world consequences, such as all the different types of systems or functions or processes that wouldn't work simply because this very important central system had a problem. If we move on then to risk two, misuse of access to CTL files and systems, similar to unauthorized access, we may have attacks on confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Because previously with unauthorized access, it was about someone who should not be able to access something, does have access, and then what can they do? In this case, we're turning that around a little bit and saying, we know someone has access to something and they should have access to it, but it's about them using that access correctly for the right reasons. So we may have someone who has access to confidential information and they read about other people's salary information, something like that. It's not unauthorized. They're meant to see it, but they might read this information and then they go and tell someone else about it. They might also use that access to change the information or destroy it. They might, again, affect someone's ability to access something. In terms of threat sources, we may have an ignorant employee who doesn't understand that they're not supposed to talk about things that they can access as part of their job with other people who would normally not have access to that sort of thing. So someone may have a conversation with another employee over lunch about stuff that they saw in the financial information because they're in the finance department, but they're not supposed to talk about this with somebody else. We may have an employee who transferred from one department to another and didn't have their access changed. So they can therefore go back to see the information that was relevant to their previous role, but not relevant currently. And they're not necessarily doing anything bad with it, but they're just curious. It's sort of like the curious employee from the previous example where someone finds out that they shouldn't have access to something, but they're interested in seeing what they can access. So they just go exploring. In this case, someone knows they have access to something and they might just, they did have access and they should not anymore. They might go and just have a look and can I still access that? Oh, they can. Then they can monitor information from another area of the company that they're not supposed to see anymore. Or, of course, we could have a malicious actor who has access to something that's legitimately part of their job. They might, for example, steal customer records, or they might steal financial information or something else, and they threaten to, well, they then sell that basically on the dark web. So they have legitimate access, but then they're using it for something they're not supposed to. Of course, it's not just about disclosing confidential information. If we had a malicious actor, they could deliberately go and destroy or modify information so that other people can't do their job. They might want to cause harm to the company. They might want the DLP to not be available. So they might deliberately go and mess around with who can access it. They might deliberately corrupt some of the code or other files so that the system doesn't work. They've got legitimate access. They might be a tech support person, and for whatever reason, they just decide to cause trouble. This is misuse of authorized access. In terms of risk factors, we may have employees who potentially don't understand the authorized uses for different types of data. As we mentioned previously, we may have an offboarding issue. In this case, you might call this cross-boarding, when someone has transferred within a company from one department to another, but that would often involve changing what they can access. So it's a similar issue. Similar to the other risk about access control, we may have access reviews that don't take place. And we already know that the digital logistics platform and other CTL systems store sensitive information, and the DLP is critical to cargo trail logistics operations. In terms of consequences, we know that C, I, and A are all affected, and the illicit consequences is the same as the previous risk, because ultimately we're talking about when people have access to confidential information or imported files and systems. These are all the bad things they can do. It's essentially the same. Well, risk 3, ransomware deployment. We know that it's possible when ransomware is deployed, it extracts confidential information to potentially be used as part of the ransom process. It's not just locking access to your files you've already got stored on your devices or your cloud storage or whatever, and then potentially locking you out of your devices. It's also first exfiltrating that information so that the attacker has a copy that they can potentially release and disclose publicly unless you pay the ransom. This is part of the ransom process, that they could potentially disclose confidential information. They are directly attacking the file integrity because they are encrypting it. So it's directly hitting the files themselves. As we discussed in a previous video, when we're talking about availability, this is, say, if the devices have a problem. So it's accessing the information is perfectly fine through a system or a device or something like that, where the device or the system has a problem. So in this case, they are actually encrypting the information directly. So the device might work, but the information on it is encrypted. So the information has the problem. But then we can also have the information maybe being okay, but then the device is inaccessible. The device has a problem. So we need to consider all three things. In terms of threat sources for the ransomware risk, an employee may be sent an email with a phishing link in it. And so the employee clicks on the link and it downloads the ransomware. It may take them to a website. And then through using that website that looks like something real, but it's really a malicious website, through using that website, they may download the ransomware. It might be sent an SMS. And this tricks them to go to, say, an incorrect website. It may alert them there's some kind of problem, use this link. And then on their phone, they go to a website and then that downloads it. You could also just have general social engineering, which is tricking people into thinking that you are someone you're not, that there's some kind of urgent issue going on, or just a suspicious downloaded file. Someone may have just browsed your website all by themselves and they accidentally downloaded this. Or risk factors. It's possible that CTO employees do not have sufficient security awareness training. So this relates to, say, the phishing email, the smishing, or social engineering, but also just random websites with random downloadable files. People may not be aware of what ransomware is and the potential risks around it, why it's a problem, what it does. On devices, they may not have antivirus installed at all, to be honest. But even if it is there, it may not have been updated with virus definitions. So this means if the software is looking for bad things like malware, if it doesn't know what the latest type of malware is, it can't really look for it if it hasn't been updated. Then we know that CTL systems store sensitive information. It may be that CTL employees store sensitive information locally on their laptop. So therefore, if that device alone was compromised, that could lead to the exfiltration of confidential information, and potentially this could be disclosed later. In terms of backups, we don't know if CTL backup critical business data. So if we had critical data encrypted and therefore we have to pay the ransom, or it's going to be left encrypted and we can't use it anymore. If we don't have a backup, then they're in big trouble. Whereas if we did have a backup, then we could potentially delete the encrypted information, and then start using the backup copy. And then the cloud infrastructure that the digital logistics platform is stored on may not have any antivirus software in place. In terms of consequences, we know that it can affect confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I have used the same consequences as the first two risks around access control, except I have removed the consequence of shipments potentially being delivered to the wrong recipient. Because in this situation, if we think about it, ransomware is not going to go in and change who the shipment is supposed to go to. Things could still be undelivered because the system is simply not working at all. But we've always got to go through, like, you could copy paste some consequences across multiple risks, but you've always got to just stop and think, does it actually make sense? So in this situation, you could still have the disclosure of information. You could have compliance breaches, definitely financial loss if you had to, say, pay a ransom. We could have shipments unable to be delivered if the platform's not working, and all these other functions that all depend on the platform working properly. These are all still there. We still have the constant disruption of incident response, reputational damage, but it wouldn't make sense of that consequence around delivering to the wrong address. That just doesn't make any sense in the context of ransomware. So we've removed that one. But risk four, if an employee device was compromised, we could have an attack on confidentiality with information being disclosed because the employee may be storing the confidential information on their laptop. And so if someone gets access to it, then they could read the information that's on there. Someone may be working on information on their laptop. They may be creating a spreadsheet that they're going to upload to cloud storage or they're going to share with other people. And so if the device is compromised, then that could be deleted or it could be modified. And of course, if someone has access to the device, we already have a risk specifically around ransomware. So we're not talking about that here, but if it was compromised in other ways, other forms of malware could also render the device unusable so that it's inaccessible. And that's an attack on availability. In terms of threat sources, we could have a phishing email that tricks someone into downloading some software onto the device, compromising the device. We could have someone using insecure public Wi-Fi where they pose as a website. So someone thinks they're connecting to a certain website, but then because they're using a public Wi-Fi network with other people on the network, their computer can be tricked into showing them a copy of a real website to get them to log in and give away information. And then if you have people in a public workspace, maybe they're working from home, something like this, you really don't know who's around you and who might use your device if you've left it unattended, who might be looking over your shoulder and seeing what you're doing. They might see you type in a password, for example. In terms of risk factors, we may have employees using unmanaged bring your own devices, BYODs, where we don't know what they've got. We don't know if they have any antivirus. We don't know if they even have a password to log into their device. I've seen people before who just turn their laptop on and it just works. And I found it amazing that they didn't have a password in place, but some people do that. So if we don't have any kind of control over the devices people are using for work, then who knows what kind of issues we're going to have. We may not have security awareness training for the employees, similar to the ransomware. People may work remotely using public Wi-Fi networks where you don't know who else is on the network. And especially if there's no password, your computer may try to connect to a public network and someone else pretends to be that network and you just connect to their network. And then they control everything that you do because you're not connected to the internet at all. You're connected to this other person's device. As mentioned, for ransomware, we may have antivirus, whether it's on a BYOD or a company laptop, it may not be up to date. So there may be new malware that the software just cannot detect properly. And we already know that we have sensitive information stored, which means that if there is a compromise of information, like a compromise of confidentiality, that the consequences would be worse because this is sensitive rather than just ordinary information. And we know that it's possible the employees store confidential information directly on their device. So if someone compromised the device, not necessarily cloud storage or a server somewhere, but just that device, there may be information that is then disclosed. When it comes to consequences, we've already talked about information disclosure, modification, loss, or device inaccessibility. So we know this affects all three parts of the CIA triad. We have a lot fewer consequences this time because we're not talking about the DLP itself, the central beating heart of the CTL business operations, having any kind of issue with that. You could have someone whose laptop was compromised with, say, a keystroke logger, and then their account information can be harvested, and then someone can use that to log into their account and get access to the DLP and do all kinds of bad things. And I was originally going to include that in this risk, but I thought to make it a bit different, I would leave that out. So I've removed a lot of the consequences. I thought mainly around what could happen specifically from a device being compromised. So because you could have people storing information on the device, we still have the possibility of disclosure of sensitive information. This could lead to a compliance breach and resulting financial loss. If someone's device is not working properly, then no matter what their job is at the company, they couldn't work as expected. So you have lost productivity. We then have the usual incident response and investigation. And if there was a compliance breach, disclosure of confidential information, then it could lead to reputational damage. Moving on to risk 5, loss of critical business data. This one gets a bit more interesting because we're not talking about confidential information being disclosed. We're not talking about systems being unavailable. We are purely talking about information that is necessary for things to function not being available. So it's just an attack on integrity in the form of information loss. For threat sources, we could have employee error, where someone accidentally deletes critical information. We could have a compromised account that is used by a malicious outside actor to deliberately delete information. We could have a malicious insider who uses their access to delete information. We could have something like ransomware. So this does overlap a little bit with some of the previous risks, but to illustrate the different types of situations, different types of risks that you might encounter, and to be able to talk about these different situations a bit more, I thought I would include this as a separate risk. Risk factors, we may have employees or users accidentally modifying or deleting information in SharePoint or the digital logistics platform. And then we have the accompanying fact that information stored in those two locations may not have a backup. We may also have people storing data locally on their device instead of in the cloud. So if someone's working on something critical and they only store it on their laptop, and then something happens to it, then there's no copy anywhere else. So it creates a problem. In terms of consequences, this time we're only talking about integrity. We don't have confidential information being considered since this is purely around the loss of critical business data. And we're also not talking about availability in terms of systems not being able to function. This is just data that's used by employees to do their job or data that's used by a system to function correctly, where the system still runs properly. It's just that the information that it depends on is not working. So it's not an attack on the system, it's an attack on information. So we've got things like if we don't know shipment information, then we don't know who to deliver it to. We might send it to the wrong place, or we might not deliver it at all. We cannot do customs clearance if we don't have information relating to that. We can't do things like invoicing. Employees can't work. We can't track things, customer service. So similar consequences to previously, but this time it's just built around integrity. Moving on to risk 6, inadequate incident response and recovery processes, which is quite a common risk that you can find all over the place. In this case, we're not really talking about any particular type of incident. We're just talking generally if something was to happen, the response is just not going to be good enough. It's not going to be fast enough. It's not going to be comprehensive enough. The wrong actions might be taken. So therefore, this is a very broad risk where if anything happens, it's simply worse than it would need to be if we had a good system in place to respond to it. So for that reason, this affects everything. It's very broad. For threat sources, I'm just keeping it simple. We could have an employee error that leads to some kind of incident, or we could have a phishing attack that leads to various consequences. If an account was compromised, and that a compromised account could be used to do just about anything: disclose information, delete information, modify people's access to systems so they can't access it, therefore it's an availability issue. In terms of risk factors, CTL may not have an incident response plan in place. A lot of companies are like that, unfortunately. They don't have anything in place at all. They may have something, but it's unofficial. We don't know if they do any testing. It's one thing to have a plan, but when things go wrong, people may panic and they don't even remember there's a plan. They might not know where it is, and they just end up improvising. And then there's no point in having a plan in the first place. It's quite important that people have practice using these things. They understand their responsibility and what they need to do. We also may have logs that have been tampered. So when users do things, when systems do things, when events happen with laptops and servers and various platforms and things, you'd normally log certain things. You have a record of what happened. So you know this user did this certain thing at this certain time. You know that, therefore, that user was responsible for copying this information, and then they might have copied onto, say, an external storage drive. They might have deleted what was on the cloud because they're a malicious insider who's trying to cause trouble for the company. So they might have intended to release this information, disclose it publicly, plus deny the company the ability to use its own information. So if we have things like logs in place, we can ideally track what is happening. But in this case, we may have the logs that are being stored somewhere, and if someone has access to the logs, they can delete the records of the bad things that they've done. So this is its own issue. We may not have incidents reported because people don't know what an incident is. They don't understand that something could be more serious than they think. This could be its own issue. We may have a SIEM misconfigured. A SIEM being security information in event management. It's a tool that analyzes log information. So as I said previously in that example, you might have someone who has copied something onto an external drive and then deleted the copy in the cloud. They want to download it onto the laptop first to copy it to an external drive, and then they've deleted what was in the cloud. So you may have a SIEM who's monitoring what people are doing through the log information, and it may detect a pattern that looks quite suspicious. So they may or may not have a SIEM, and if they do, it may be misconfigured, may not be doing its job properly. And then similar to what I was saying about the logs, where you may have employees who deliberately delete evidence if they're the one doing the bad thing. They may delete the logs. You may have employees also who are not responsible for the incident, but they may end up accidentally deleting evidence because they're not following a plan that's quite clear about what they're supposed to do. And ideally, this would preserve the evidence as much as possible. In terms of consequences, as already discussed, this risk is very broad because it's essentially on top of any other risk. If any other bad thing happens, it's made even worse because you don't have these processes in place. So we already know it's very broad. It affects all different types of situations. So it affects confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And we have this full list of consequences. Then we have risk 7, the AWS cloud infrastructure tenancy compromise, where the DLP is running from. Because this hosts the DLP and access to the infrastructure storing the DLP allows access to the DLP and anything that it deals with. This is also quite broad. We know the DLP handles confidential information. We know that if there was modification or loss to information used by the DLP, then the system couldn't function properly. It would lead to all kinds of problems. And we know that we could have the system being out or service disruption if the infrastructure was affected, because it literally hosts the platform that this company depends on to conduct its operations. So if we had an issue with the AWS infrastructure, then this core DLP app can easily be made to not work properly. Threat sources, we could have a malicious external actor who, say, uses phishing to compromise the account of a CTL employee who has access to the tenancy. We may have a legitimate employee with malicious intentions who has access to the tenancy. We may also have someone who's set up the cloud infrastructure and forgot to set it to be non-public so that you have to log in to access it. This does happen. People make errors with things like configurations, and it can definitely lead to security incidents. For risk factors, cargo trail logistics may not have a change management process in place. So they may have made some changes to the DLP or to the cloud infrastructure. And if there isn't a proper process in place to ensure that the changes were meant to be made, that the right person is authorized to make the changes have been reviewed for the kind of risk that they introduce, and then there's a process to make sure that it's done properly, you could have a misconfiguration. For example, you could allow issues to creep in. You may not have a configuration review process in place, so someone may just make a small routine change. Maybe they're not aware of what they're doing, and they make a mistake with the configuration. If you don't have a review process in place, then you wouldn't catch that. And employees may not have sufficient experience or training to manage the environment properly. Consequences, as we discussed, this affects a lot of what the company does. People would have access to confidential information. They could attack the integrity of information, modifying or deleting it, and they could affect the ability for people to access systems like the DLP. So this has our full list of consequences that we've used already. For risk 8, we're talking about some kind of software vulnerability in the DLP that gets exploited. And because people would then get access to the core system for this company, CTL, you could then have information disclosure, modification or loss, system unavailability, or service disruption. So quite broad consequences, because once again, we're talking about the core system at the heart of CTL. For threat sources, we could have an employee who's coding the app. They may make an error and introduce code such that hackers can hack their way in. We then may have external actors who can act on this vulnerability and exploit it to hack the app. We may also have malicious insiders who deliberately write vulnerable code, which will allow people to hack in. Maybe they plan to hack in themselves, and they're just using their access to create a way for them to do this. For risk factors, the software developers at cargo trail logistics may not follow secure coding practices, including things like code review and following things like the OWASP Top 10, basically guidelines on common issues that are used by hackers to get access to apps. You should obviously learn from things like this that tell you about the major issues that other apps have to make sure you don't have the same issues in your own app. There may not have been penetration testing on the digital logistics platform. Penetration testing being when people are hired by a company or the government or someone to hack into something and find the issues that real hackers would otherwise probably find themselves over time. And so if you can find these issues ahead of time, identify them, then you can fix these problems before a real hacker can find the same problem, get access, and then cause true issues. CTL may not have vulnerability scanning in place, which is to say, scanning their app to make sure there are no vulnerabilities identified by other people with similar code, with similar code dependencies that may be present in your app. Again, it's trying to learn from other people so that you can preempt something happening to you. There may also have been issues identified and they're not being dealt with in a timely manner. Basically, when you have a patch, it's when someone's identified a problem and you have an update to the patch to fix the issue. And if you're not applying updates in time, it may be that someone figures out you're using an old version of something because you haven't patched it yet, and then they can exploit that to get access to your app. So it's quite important to do patches quickly. There also might be a misconfiguration where you don't need to log in to access the DLP, for example. It's publicly accessible instead of requiring authentication. So errors like this can happen as well. And as mentioned previously, we may have software dependencies that are compromised or vulnerable. And because you package this up into the DLP, a lot of times people don't really know what they're actually packaging up into their software because you have multiple layers of dependency where someone creates a function, some code, someone else bundles that up, someone else takes that and bundles that up, and then you use that bundle and multiple layers down, there may be problems. People don't necessarily do a supply chain risk analysis and look at where they're getting their code from through multiple layers of dependency. We then have our usual list of consequences, as we know that we can have quite broad consequences to the DLP being exploited. We can have information disclosure, modification lost, or system disruption, system unavailability. So therefore, it affects confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Moving on, we have risk 9, digital logistics platform service disruption. So in this case, we are specifically talking about an availability type issue where it's not about information being disclosed, it's not about information being attacked through modification or deletion. It's purely about the DLP platform at the center of cargo trade logistics operations, this having some kind of service problem, which is purely an availability issue. For threat sources, when you're using a cloud infrastructure provider like AWS, it's just a simple fact that occasionally they have problems, that their infrastructure is not available and anything stored on the infrastructure is also not available. It's very unlikely, but occasionally it happens. And sometimes you have large worldwide consequences to things like this. So we could have an AWS outage. We also could just have an error in the DLP code where in a certain situation, the system just crashes. It's just not usable because someone made an error when they were coding it. We may have a distributed denial of service attack where a lot of devices send a request for information or they're telling information to the system, and you just do that in huge volume to overwhelm the system. So instead of operating normally where it has all different types of things going on, if it has a huge amount of one task going on, it has to devote all its resources to trying to deal with this task, where normally you'd deal with a task and it's closed and then you can move on to do other things. But if you just keep getting repeated requests to do something and you try to solve it, but the normal mechanism for solving it doesn't work and you keep getting a fresh request again and again and again, then it's not going to work properly. And then no one else can do other things. The other functions of the app are not going to function correctly because you're devoting everything just to solving one issue that will not go away. And then we could have a faulty update where, similar to the coding error, we have maybe the code was okay initially, but then when someone was doing an update, they accidentally code it such that something breaks and the system doesn't work properly after they've done the update. For risk factors, we then have, as we discussed with the threat sources, we may not have sufficient testing of updates before release. So this could be an issue with, say, a faulty update. Infrastructure as a service providers like AWS do have outages. They cannot guarantee 100% availability, which is to say that the system's working all the time. CTL may not have a disaster recovery plan in place, which is to say when there is some kind of technical failure, do you have a plan in place to restore the system? Maybe you have another copy somewhere. Maybe ideally you'd have a different cloud provider and you can use their infrastructure to host your app as well in case your primary provider has a problem. But it's a plan to deal with some kind of technical failure like a massive service disruption. Then you can have solutions that provide distributed denial of service protection in place, and it may be that there is no system to provide this protection. Consequences, we know that we are just dealing with availability, as we discussed earlier. So if the system's unavailable, we can have financial loss because this system is core to CTL making money. If the system's not available, then we have all these other functions that are not working because it depends on the DLP to work properly. Employees can't work. We can't track shipments. Customer service cannot be done. Financial processes are disrupted. And then across all the incidents, we've always got the costs and disruption of incident response and investigation. Plus, because we can't service customers, we then have reputational damage as well. For risk 10, DLP API connectivity not available. API being application programming interface. It's how different programs talk to each other. So when you make a program and you want another program to be able to talk to it, you need the information to come in a certain format. with certain attributes or characteristics to that information so that your app can interpret the information correctly. So you make sure that you publish this information so for other people to integrate with your app, they know how to set up the information so it arrives in such a way that your app can read it correctly and use it. So we're now talking about availability only, similar to the previous one. This is about the app working correctly. It's not necessarily about what information the app is handling, but just is the app working correctly? For threat sources, similar to the previous risk where we talk about a distributed denial of service attack, connectivity may not be available for legitimate traffic because we have a huge amount of traffic from someone who's trying to block our system from working. So that could be one reason we don't have API connectivity. We also could have an error in our system. So our system is not correctly understanding information that's coming in, where our system is connecting with other people's systems, like, for example, supplier systems, custom clearance software. We need to make sure that we're sending information to those systems correctly. So we've coded it incorrectly, then it's not going to work. And then we also might have not necessarily a deliberate attack, but we may just have a very busy time with lots of information coming in of a certain type, and our system is just not able to deal with the amount of legitimate traffic that's coming in. Maybe we had the DLP set up expecting we'd have a certain number of customers, and suddenly we have lots and lots of shipments happening all at the same time. Maybe it's around like Christmas or something like that. And so they're legitimate things, but we've just designed our app to not necessarily cope with the amount of legitimate customer information coming in. And so our system just gets overwhelmed, but it's legitimate traffic. For risk factors, we may not have API rate limiting in place, which is to say that when you get a lot of requests of a certain type, the app recognizes this is happening and it understands that if it simply tries to resolve this, then its performance overall will slow down or fail completely. So it understands to only devote some resources to dealing with a certain type of request coming in, for example. So if the customs clearance software is sending it something and it suddenly does a lot of traffic from the customs clearance software, it knows that that is abnormal and it should not devote all its time and attention to that, because then everything else will fall apart and the app will not function in all the other ways that it's supposed to. Then we may not have infrastructure scaling in place, which is to say we may design the app to be smaller when we're starting out. CTL doesn't have that many customers, but then suddenly overnight, CTL may become a lot more popular, a lot more customers want to use it. And if we haven't set up the infrastructure so that AWS can give us more resources to have more compute power to process requests and things like this, we don't have this in place, we may get overwhelmed through legitimate traffic, as we set up here. So ideally, you have the ability to scale up your cloud infrastructure as you need it. We may have coding errors in our software so that we don't receive information correctly from other apps. It may be that if someone else wants to integrate with us, that they may have errors, so they're not receiving our traffic correctly, which still contributes to the overall idea of the DLP, whether it's receiving or sending information, it still needs API connectivity with lots of different systems. What consequences then? We're just talking about availability. And because we're talking about, therefore, the function of the system, is it working correctly? If it's not working correctly, then we may not be able to deliver shipments. We may have custom clearance issues. We may not be able to track shipments. We have the issues associated with incident response and investigation and reputational damage, because this is all around specifically the types of systems. I won't do it now, but if you look back at the data flow diagram, if we look at the systems that CTL DLP connects to, if those particular things are not working, what would happen? It's not to say the core function of the app doesn't work, but we depend on different outside systems. And if that's not working, then what sort of issues do we have? For risk 11, we have legacy warehouse software being compromised. As discussed in a previous video, when we were coming up with the initial ideas for the risks, we know from the scenario that some of the software used by CTL at some of their warehouses is legacy software. That is to say, it's old and it's not supported by the original software developer anymore, such that as bugs, errors, vulnerabilities pop up over time, people discover them by accident. Other people might intentionally try and search for these. There's no one to actively make patches to fix these problems. So it can be that if you're known to use a certain old type of software and there are known vulnerabilities for it, you need to do something about that, because if someone discovers that you use something, they know exactly how to hack their way in because it's publicly known, it's widely available. So this is always a bit of a concern, especially in real life in the case of things like industrial control systems. If you have industrial equipment, whether it's things like mining equipment, whether it's factory systems, power stations, water utilities, when you have large industrial machinery, industrial applications, you often have equipment running on this old software that people are very reluctant to turn off, even though the software might be decades old, because if the system shuts down and then doesn't start again with the new software, or because you try to play around with the old software, that could be catastrophic as well from an operational point of view. So ideally, these systems would be upgraded, but there is the risk in those specific cases that you cause the operations to cease completely while you're trying to fix the legacy software. If we look at the CIA impacts, we've identified information modification loss or system unavailability or service disruption. If the warehouse software was compromised, then people could go in and say, modify or delete shipment information. They could also just cause the system to crash and therefore it doesn't work. So we're talking about integrity and availability issues. For threat sources, as mentioned, a big one when it comes to legacy software is publicly known vulnerabilities that someone has already discovered, and they can link that to a certain type of software, a certain version of that software. If someone knows that you're using that, then they essentially know your vulnerabilities straight away. Even though this version of the software might have publicly known vulnerabilities, if people don't know that you use that version of the software, then they cannot necessarily exploit it. But if we have an insider, they know exactly what the vulnerabilities are because they know exactly what software is being used if they work at the warehouse facility and they use the software themselves. For risk factors, we know that CTEL operates legacy warehouse routing software at some of their facilities. This was given to us in initial scenario information. And when it comes to legacy software, we ideally need to do everything that we can to make it more secure. This includes measures like hardening, where we disable features that we don't need. We check configurations and we make it as secure as possible, turning things off, reducing things to the bare minimum that we actually need. We don't know if CTL has done any hardening for this legacy software. And we often find that legacy software, like all software, will tend to have vulnerabilities. The problem with legacy software is that no one is still paying attention and putting in the time and effort to fix these problems when they become known. We can then remove confidentiality as a risk consequence. And we know that if the software is compromised, it could be used to disrupt the shipment information in terms of where shipments are going, who it's addressed to. The information may be deleted, so therefore we don't know where it's supposed to go at all, and it just cannot be delivered. Employees working in the warehouse who are trying to handle the inventory of cargo there wouldn't be able to work if the system goes down or if they don't have information related to the shipment to be able to send it to the right location. As always, we have cost and disruption from the standard incident response process whenever anything goes wrong. And because we could have shipments that are delayed, delivered to the wrong location, not delivered at all, our customers wouldn't be very happy about that. And therefore, we have reputation damage. Risk 12, we have the shipment routing engine being unavailable. This is a very specific risk because this is a certain platform that the DLP depends on to be able to route shipments on the optimal route to have a more efficient, shorter time to delivery. It's not to say this is essential for the service to function properly, but it helps us to run more efficiently. Since we're talking about the route, it's not necessarily about any confidential information. We're not necessarily having access to information that is being tampered with or destroyed, but our system relies on another system to feed us information. And if we don't have that access, then it's an availability issue because we're talking about a platform outage. Because this is a more specific risk, we can be more specific and not as broad when it comes to threat sources, and say in this case it is a supplier service disruption. For risk factors, we know that CTL depends on this third-party platform for optimal shipment routing to make the shipping time shorter using the most efficient route. But it's not unreasonable to think that freight carriers do have alternative ways of navigating from the point of pickup to a warehouse, from the warehouse to maybe another warehouse, and then from a warehouse to the final delivery location. They could use, for example, some navigation app on their phone. For risk consequences, we know this is just availability. Because we would have suboptimal routing, we could face some financial loss because we have increased, say, expenses from freight carriers if they charge us on the fuel that they use, for example. So we could potentially have, depending on the contracts between our customers and CTO, we may have financial losses if we don't deliver as quickly as we promised because we end up being delayed using a suboptimal route. We might have had someone go the wrong way. A driver, he might have got stuck in a traffic jam he could have avoided. And because we were late, that leads to not only customer dissatisfaction, but we might have had, some kind of penalty because we said we were going to be there by a certain time. We may also have customs clearance delay if we don't get to the customs clearance facility by a certain time on a certain day, for example. Maybe we missed it, so we have to wait until the next day, so the whole shipment gets delayed. As usual, we have cost and disruption of incident response and investigation, and because we're delivering late, it's not going to be good for our reputation. For risk 13, this is similar to the previous risk in that it's about the shipment routing engine, but it's different because instead of it being unavailable, we're specifically saying that it has been compromised. So a malicious actor of some kind has gained control of it. And therefore, instead of denying us the ability to use it, we are being intentionally fed the wrong information. Therefore, we can say that this is specifically about information modification and or loss, which means integrity. On threat sources, we could have a compromised user account at the supplier who gives us the shipment routing service. They may have had their account compromised by a phishing email or other means, but it would be an external actor who's got control of a user account, and then they can do what they want with the system using that person's account. Alternatively, we could have a legitimate user who has malicious intentions, so a malicious insider. For risk factors, we don't know if CTO has any visibility into the security posture of the routing engine service provider. So we don't know what measures they have in place to protect user accounts, if people are trained or not, if they have antivirus software, if they do access reviews, all these different things. We have no idea what they do. We also have the routing engine service provider potentially not being aware of security incidents, or they may not report them to CTL. It depends what's in the contract between CTL and the supplier and whether we can trust the supplier to honor the contract or not. And then we have a truck driver for a freight carrier used by CTL. They may receive bad directions for where to drive with their shipment, and they may actually follow them, even though they might think a certain way is better just from their experience driving around. They may follow the directions anyway, and they end up going to some far off place that they don't need to go to. So we don't know if there's any resistance from these drivers to receiving bad directions or not. With consequences, we can then say this is integrity only. If we had bad directions guiding where the freight company was taking the shipment, we could end up with financial losses because we could have delivery delays. We might have things not be delivered at all. We might have shipments being taken to the wrong location deliberately, with deliberate wrong directions being provided, such that the shipment, maybe it's stolen. Maybe this is a gang who's doing this sort of thing. Of course, if we're going the wrong way deliberately because we're given these wrong directions, we may not get to do customs clearance in time if we had a certain time we needed to be there by. our own employees would then expect a shipment to arrive at a certain time. And if that shipment takes a while longer or doesn't arrive at all, then the warehouse employees trying to handle the cargo when it arrives, they can't work as they would normally do. Of course, we have the usual cost and disruption of incident response and investigation. And because we're talking about late or just non-existent delivery, we would have reputational damage as well. For risk 14, we now have the idea of a freight carrier system being unavailable. This is different to the shipment routing engine because in that case, we were only talking about guiding where the delivery driver was taking the shipment to. In this case, it's the delivery driver themselves, whether they show up or not. Because if the system's not available, it's likely that there will be a problem with them showing up. So we're talking about service disruption because their system's unavailable. For threat sources, the freight carrier may have had a security incident on their end, and this has led to their system not working. Or they may have just had a more general service disruption. Maybe their infrastructure provider had some kind of outage. Maybe they had some kind of coding error and they've just had a disruption to normal service without it necessarily being a malicious deliberate attack. In terms of risk factors, we don't know if CTO have considered the scenario of a supplier system being booked to handle a shipment, but then later on that system's not available, that supplier is not able to be contacted. We don't know if they've tested the DLP with the situation, so we don't know how it would react. We don't know if the system would just would it alert someone? Would it do nothing? Would it just carry on and wonder why things aren't being delivered? We simply don't know. We may also have freight carriers not necessarily reporting outages or incidents to CTL, and the DLP may not have the ability to reassign a shipment to another freight carrier if we've already assigned it and then there's a problem with that carrier. Risk consequences, we already know this is just around availability because it is service disruption. Because we may have shipments unable to be delivered or they might be delayed, we could be looking at financial loss as well. We could have penalties with customers if we deliver late or if we don't deliver at all. We may not be able to do customs clearance as expected if we do not have the shipment show up at a certain time. If we have a problem with the delivery, then we may not be able to invoice our customers and get paid for the shipment. Employees may not be able to work properly because we have a shipment that was supposed to be delivered and they're unable to process that shipment because we've had a delay or it was not delivered at all. Similar to the invoicing, we may have had financial processes disrupted. Perhaps we receive an invoice from the freight carrier system, and now that their system is down, they can't give us the invoice and they need us to pay them. We may also have financial processes disrupted. Perhaps this supplier has previous shipments with us that they were invoicing us for and we were going to pay for. And now that is all shut down as well. It's not just about a particular delivery that gets not collected and taken as we would expect. We've also got the usual cost and disruption of incident response and investigation. And again, reputational damage because we are not necessarily delivering as our customers expect us to. For risk 15, we then have a similar but different situation of the freight carrier system being compromised, not necessarily not available. It's not working as we would expect. In terms of threat sources, there may have been a security incident at the freight carrier supplier. They may have had, more specifically, an incident around a compromised user account, perhaps through phishing, or we could have had a malicious insider who worked at the freight carrier. For risk factors, we don't know if CTL have tested the DLP with a compromised supplier system scenario. We don't know if the DLP will detect that something's wrong, if it's going to act in a different way, or if it's just going to proceed and be misled, or whatever the consequences are from the system being compromised. We also don't know if the freight carriers will report any issues that they have to CTL. And we don't know if the DLP can assign a freight shipment to another freight carrier if the original one it was assigned to has a problem. For risk consequences, we know that we're dealing with availability because this risk is about service disruption. So if we have shipments that are unable to be delivered, or we have a delay because we've tried to arrange the shipment with the supplier and then they've told us, for example, that they're going to come and collect the shipment, but that was not a real statement, it was a false statement because the system's in compromise, we could then have delay or things are not delivered. We therefore have financial loss as well. We may have issues with customs clearance. We then would have issues with the customer who wanted that shipment because we can't invoice them if they don't get delivery. Our employees trying to handle that shipment can't work properly. We can't invoice the supplier if there were issues with them coming to pick up the shipment because they were supposed to and maybe they never showed up. Their system was telling us they were going to come and collect it because it was compromised. We were receiving false information. The usual incident response, cost and disruption, and because this is affecting our ability to deliver, and CTL is a logistic company, reputational damage. For risk 16, we are talking about the shipment tracking being unavailable. Similar to the routing engine, tracking is also done through a vendor. If we go back and look at the data flow diagram, there is an integration between the supplier for this service and the DLP. And if their system is unavailable, the tracking system, then we know this is service disruption. For threat sources, this could be a service disruption, like some kind of accidental outage, or this could also be a system compromise, which leads the system to be unavailable. For the risk factors, we know that customers and CTL employees expect real-time shipment tracking through the DLP, and that relies on this supplier providing this tracking information. We know this is an availability issue because we're talking about service disruption. With shipment tracking unavailable, we may end up with a delivery delay. We may have a situation where the CTL warehouse needs to plan who's going to be there, what they're going to do with shipments when they arrive based on their delivery. And we are tracking their real-time location using this software, and therefore that feeds into the whole operational system that we've got. If we don't have that live tracking coming in, we may have the potential for delays. We may also be using that tracking information to predict when we're going to arrive at, say, customs, and we may have issues if we don't arrive there when we're supposed to, when we were expected. We would have employees who expect shipments to arrive at a certain time. They would be tracking it, and then they'd be planning other activities around this. And if they can't track the shipment, then they cannot plan their activities as they normally would. Of course, shipments cannot be tracked. It's another consequence. We would also have incident response if we realize that suddenly these shipments cannot be tracked as we would normally expect. And because we're looking at potential delivery delay due to not being able to track and give live, accurate updates on delivery times, we may not deliver on time and therefore have reputational damage. Or at 17, we have an invalid invoice being paid. This quite simply leads to financial loss because we are paying money for what we think is a real invoice, but it's really not. It's a false invoice, and the money's gone then. We would then potentially have the real invoice come in, and then we realize there's a problem because we believe we've already paid the supplier for this shipment, but that was not the case. And it's possible that that money cannot be reclaimed. For threat sources, we may have the invoice being paid because we have a malicious insider who is in the finance department. They might submit the invoice themselves, or someone they know and they're collaborating with might submit this invoice, and then this person may be involved in the invoice approval process. Or if it's purely an external party who is doing this, it could just be the error of an employee in CTL who receives this invoice and they approve the false invoice and make payment against it. For risk factors, we don't know if the CTL finance team strictly checks incoming invoices or not. And in terms of insiders, we don't know if there is separation of duties, which is to say, when you have a process like processing an invoice, approving it, and then making payment against it, if one person is responsible for all of those things, then they could absolutely facilitate this kind of fraud. And ideally, you would not have a situation like that. You would have different people who do different things. Not to say that the fraud couldn't occur, but it's more difficult to make it happen because you need more people inside to collaborate together. And we simply don't know what CTL has in place. In terms of how we classify this in the CIA triad, we would say this is integrity because we're talking about information that is false. So it's not about a system not being available. It's not about disclosing something confidential. It's about the information itself being wrong or damaged in some way. There's some problem with the information itself. And so since we're receiving false information, we can say this is an attack on integrity. And because we have paid out an invalid invoice, we therefore have financial loss. The processes will be disrupted because we would need to figure out what went wrong. Once it's discovered that the money's missing, that the real invoice came in that we thought had already been paid, and we figure out this is not the case, this would, of course, require incident response and investigation and the associated costs and disruption. Because in this case, it's more of an internal issue, we're not involving our customers, we're not involving our suppliers. We thought it was involving a supplier, but it wasn't. This is purely internal. We don't have anything like reputation damage, for example, that we would have in most other risks. For risk 18, we have a fake freight carrier being used. This could lead to information disclosure. If we had the shipment being delivered from a warehouse to the customer, then the delivery would need the customer information. So if we hired a fake freight carrier, we'd be giving them the customer information so they could theoretically deliver to the customer. Of course, it was not an authorized disclosure of information because we've given it to the wrong people. We've sent it over to a company pretending to be a freight carrier. We thought we were hiring them, but they're not a freight carrier at all. So they've taken the shipment and we don't know where it's gone. We've given over the information regarding the customer, but we would also be looking at financial loss if we have given the shipment that we are responsible for to someone and then it never shows up. For threat sources, we could have a malicious external actor who is outside of CTL and they convince people in the company that they are a freight carrier who can do deliveries for them. And in reality, they're not. So they send, for example, a truck to collect a shipment, and then the shipment just disappears because we don't know who we've actually given it to. They were posing as a company and they were lying to CTL. We could also have a malicious insider who knows how the system works at CTL, and they either on their own, which is probably not as likely, but more likely in a group, they would collaborate together to steal a shipment, essentially book a fake freight company, and then the shipment goes off on a truck and then no one ever sees it again. In terms of risk factors, we don't know if CTO have any vetting process in place before they hire a freight carrier to do deliveries for them. We don't know if the CTL business insurance requires stricter supplier vetting in order to be valid. If they didn't vet suppliers at all or didn't check them strongly enough, then maybe their insurance wouldn't apply. And we know that CTL relies on freight carriers to move shipments around, that they don't actually do the transport themselves. So they need to hire people to do this. Consequences, we're talking about confidentiality and integrity. Confidentiality, because we already know that we may be giving away the information relating to the customer, since they are the shipment, and we would need to give this to a freight carrier who we hired to deliver the shipment to them. We're also looking at financial loss because we would be not delivering to the correct person. It would probably not be delivered at all, and we would be responsible for the shipment. So we're looking at financial loss. We would also then not be able to have customs clearance go ahead if the shipment has disappeared. We would not be able to track it either because if we hired a legitimate freight carrier, they would have the tracking system in their vehicle. And since we've given it to someone else who is not a legitimate freight forwarder, it's highly unlikely they would have this tracking system. And so we wouldn't know where the shipment has gone. We would also have our financial processes disrupted since we could not invoice our customer for a shipment that was supposed to go to them when they never got it, since we've given it to someone else and they've potentially run away with it. We have the usual incident response and investigation costs, and once again, reputational damage, since we've given away a customer's shipment to someone and it never showed up. So that customer is probably going to question working with CTL in future. For risk 19, we have the IT managed service provider account being compromised. This could be potentially quite damaging. We've got very broad consequences here. That's because the IT managed service provider manages things like endpoint security. And this would allow them, if the account was compromised, the person who compromised the account could use this to then say disable the security on an employee's laptop. They could then use targeted phishing to get that employee to download some malware, and especially because they would have a proper legitimate account from the managed service provider, it's more likely that they could craft a phishing email which would be more successful at convincing the target to download the software, whatever they're supposed to do. Having compromised the laptop, they could then use this access to compromise that person's account and then get access to anything in CTL, especially if they targeted an executive or a department manager, someone with IT admin access who was able to do lots of different things. This would then let them do whatever they wanted within CTL systems. For threat sources, we could have, as I was saying, a phishing email. This could be used to compromise the account at the managed service provider. This could also then be used by that compromised account to compromise someone at CTL. We could also have a different type of security incident not reported at the managed service provider, and then this leads to greater consequences for CTL. Risk factors are that we have no idea of visibility into the security practices of this company. We simply don't know what they do. We don't know if they would report a security incident that they experienced to CTL. We don't know if CTL has a tested and effective business continuity plan in place, such that if something happens to disrupt business operations and processes, we have a plan that they can go to and understand what they need to do through alternative means to accomplish the normal tasks and processes they would do. Essentially, a backup plan for the business to still function if something was to go wrong. And it's possible that the managed service provider accounts have direct access to CTL systems. In terms of consequences, then, we know this could affect confidentiality, integrity, or availability because of the broad way in which a compromised account like this could affect CTL, since it would enable them to get access to all these other things. So we've got potential disclosure of sensitive information, which would lead to compliance breaches. We could have deliveries to the wrong place, might not be delivered at all, customs clearance. We have issues if the app is down, we couldn't have orders being placed that would disrupt invoicing and payment. Employees couldn't work as expected. We can't track shipments if the DLP is down. Customer service would also be unavailable. It disrupts lots of financial processes. We have to do a lot of incident investigation. And of course, this would lead to reputational damage since CTL's core functionality would be down. Final risk 20, we have inadequate privacy protection. In this case, we'd be looking at financial loss due to fines and penalties for not adequately protecting data that CTL was processing, was storing, was handling. Threat sources for this risk include a customer privacy complaint. If we had a customer of CTL who made a complaint to the relevant government authority in their country about how information they gave over to CTL was handled, this could be the source of it. Or we could also, of course, have a security incident. There are many different types of risks. We've already covered different types of security incidents where it involves the disclosure of customer information, personal or sensitive information. And if an investigation into that incident found that the data was not protected properly, then we could be looking at a regulatory breach. Risk factors include the fact that CTL operates around the world, including in Europe. Europe being singled out because there tend to be much stronger privacy protection regulations there, like the GDPR. Since CTL operates around the world, there will be many different jurisdictions with different privacy and data protection regulations. So it's important that CTL understands these requirements where they're doing business, because it's quite possible that CTO is not fully aware of, or they do not understand the regulatory requirements governing where they're doing business. For consequences, we're talking about confidentiality, since this is the root issue when it comes to privacy protection. We are looking after the data of customers and we have to protect this adequately, or we should not be handling the information. So we could be looking at the disclosure of information. This would then lead to a compliance breach, and this leads to a financial loss. We'd have incident response and investigation, and then we'd have reputation damage. Because it's possible that any regulatory breach involving CTL is made publicly available by the relevant authority, and therefore it's public knowledge that CTL has had a compliance breach leading to reputation damage. Okay, that was quite a long video, but we made it to the end. We've completed the risk table for all 20 risks for our client. In the next video, we'll understand what security controls are, which ones we have available to choose from, and how we should apply these to the risks that we've just completed in our risk table. Let me know in the comments if you can think of any other threat sources, risk factors, or risk consequences that we should have put in for one of the risks that we covered.